in order to study with the monks there. And his parents had the hope that one day he'd become the abbot of that great Benedictine foundation, which was established by Saint Benedict himself. He refuses to take off his habit. So his mother says, take off that white habit, and he refuses to do so. And he spends 2 years basically incarcerated in a castle. And there again, in these earliest biographies, you have stories of how his brothers go in and they try to take his habit off, and they rip it to shreds, and he puts it off anyway. They send a prostitute up to try to seduce the young man. He says a prayer, he grabs the flame of the fire in the castle, and he chases them out. He chases her out. His mother becomes so... I'm thinking about my mom. What would she say? She's converted. She sees the stubbornness of her son's heart. She sees how her son is smitten by God. So she allows him to escape the castle by climbing out of the castle down a rope. And he is taken off, he's taken back to Naples, the new Dominican convent there. Studium Generale, that's a study house for the order. But he's eventually sent back to Paris. He goes back and forth. And he serves the church as a gift from God. He preaches, he teaches, he writes. Now, when I went out, thinking about our brother, I'd like to highlight 3 things about who he was as a person. The first, obviously, he was a genius. He wrote 8 million words. This was 800 years ago. There was no laptop. Paper was hard to come by. So he dictated those 8 million words to 2 or 3 secretaries at a time. So he was writing 3 books at the same time. Book 1 with Secretary 1, Book 2 with Secretary 2, and Book 3 for Secretary 3. And he could simply talk, they write it down. While he was writing that, he'd say, go back to chapter 3 of the second book. And he wrote multiple books with dictation. And the story goes is that we're so happy he used scribes because he had horrible handwriting. And for my brothers who actually have read an autograph, that is the manuscript where Aquinas commented it on, they tell me it's horrendous. It's like chicken scratching. You can't really tell what he was saying. Now, it's interesting, at dinner today, we had an interesting discussion about whether or not Aquinas was on the spectrum. Now, clearly he was brilliant, and there are stories too that he was socially awkward. And what I mean by that is that, well, he was attending lunch with the King of France, and he forgot himself. He got so drawn into the world of ideas that it is said that in the middle of lunch, while everyone was having a social conversation, he goes, "That's the answer to the Manichees." He'd been thinking about his arguments. I don't know whether or not he was on the spectrum. All I know is that he was a space cadet. He thought, and he thought, and he thought. Now, one of the things you also have to understand is that when we think of Aquinas as a brilliant professor, we don't really remember that he was a poet as well. And we have his poems with us today, because Aquinas wrote poetry in honor of the Blessed Sacrament. And it was Aquinas himself who petitioned the Pope to establish the Feast of Corpus Christi. And the Feast of Corpus Christi is held every year around the world today, here in Baltimore, back home in Manila, to honor the Eucharist, the Blessed Sacrament. And the story is behind this great feast is the Eucharistic miracle of Belzano. It turns out that around 1260, a priest traveling to Rome stopped in the city of Belzano, and the parish priest, and he had doubts about whether or not Jesus is truly present there. His name, Peter of Prague. And while he was celebrating the Holy Mass, as he said the words of consecration, he was astounded to see blood dripping out of the consecrated host down his hands and onto the corporal on the altar. Aquinas was brought in as the expert to examine this corporal. Aquinas was the guy that the Pope sent to check it out, to determine whether or not this was in fact a bona fide miracle. You can go to Orvieto today to see this corporal. And so Aquinas, in the context of that investigation, asked the Pope to establish the feast, the great solemnity of Corpus Christi. And he composes poems, hymns that we sing today. Tantum ergo. How many of you know that? That's Aquinas. That's his poetry. You may not have read a single word of his Summa. For those of you here who are Dominicans, for those of you here who are seminarians, we read the Summa. And it should be read by every Christian. But you have heard his poetry. You have heard his music. Genius, brilliant, and yet accompanied with a tremendous humility. So again, in the earliest biographies of my brother, you hear stories of how this genius, this man, simply forgot who he was. There is a story of a young Dominican arrives in the great convent of Bologna. And at that time, when Dominicans went out of the convent, they had to go out in pairs. So this young upstart friar sees this older friar sitting there in the cloister and says, "Come, let's go out." So they're going out, they're walking through the city, the guy's got to do his errands, and the older friar can't keep up. And so the younger friar turns around and keeps correcting him. Can you not keep up? Unbeknownst to him, but known to the citizens of Bologna, his companion, his elderly companion, was Thomas Aquinas. And the biographers relate the story where the citizens were just stunned because you had this younger priest basically correcting this great master of theology. And the master of theology was simply apologizing constantly in the streets to the younger guy because he couldn't keep up. The citizens of Bologna eventually stopped the younger priest to tell him who his companion was. Aquinas refuses two ecclesiastical promotions. The Pope asked him to be Archbishop of Naples. He said no. He was also a candidate as for the abbot of Monte Cassino. Remember his mom's dreams, dad's dreams? He said no. And what you see there is a radical understanding of his vocation. Aquinas knew what he was about. He knew what God had called him to. And he was very secure in his identity. He knew he was called to be a professor. And that doing professor work well was his way to great holiness. It is said that Aquinas was never heard to have criticized any of his intellectual opponents. He only criticized their ideas. In the entire 8 million words, there's only one place where he calls one of his opponents. It must have been, it just translated to English, he says, how can you be so stupid? Prime matter cannot be a substance. Yet we're not going into that. But only once in his 8 million words have direct criticism one of his opponents. But I think what I'd like to highlight here is that he was a friend of God. And the best way to illustrate this is I'm going to read to you the last words of this great saint. So it's the 7th of May. It's probably actually 7th of March, probably the 6th of March, the day before his death. And he asks for viaticum. And viaticum is translated to English, food for the journey. And he asks for the Eucharist to be brought for the last. This is what it says. It's so beautiful. So this is what it says. Hours before he dies, in the presence of the Eucharistic, I receive you, price of the redemption of my soul. I receive you, viaticum of my pilgrimage. For your love, I have studied, I have kept vigil, and I have spent myself completely. I have preached you, I have taught you, and I have never expressed anything that is against you. And if it has even happened, I have done and if it has happened that I have done it unintentionally, I do not persist in that opinion. And if I have said anything wrong about this sacrament or anything else, I submit myself entirely to the correction of the Holy Church of Rome, in whose obedience I now lead this life. For my brothers and me, this encapsulates our life. Especially for those of us who serve in universities. We are here to preach Jesus Christ, to talk about his love, to talk about his mercy. When you read the 80 million words that Aquinas wrote, you will not see this incredible passion, this incredible obsession with God, because he was able to regulate his emotions in such a way that his intellect was able to penetrate the divine mysteries in such a way that he wanted it to be so clear that he didn't want his emotions to get in the way. But this man was a man in love. And his entire life revealed that love. Everything he did at the university, when he was a student, when he was a professor, when he was an administrator, all of these were fed by his love and revealed his love. At his canonization, during the hearings associated with this canonization, the devil's advocate, this is the canon lawyer or priest, who was given the responsibility of making the counterclaim, of arguing against the holiness of the candidate, pointed out that there were no miracles associated with Aquinas during his lifetime. There is only one recorded in the earliest biography. It turns out that Aquinas was deeply, deeply terrified by storms. And so he carried around his neck a relic of Saint Agnes, virgin and martyr. And there's a story that his secretary, his closest friend Reginald, got really sick. That Aquinas took this relic of the Virgin Martyr, placed it on his brother's chest, and prayed to God for healing, and Reginald was healed. That's the only miracle. There's another one with fish. That doesn't really count. But they didn't want to attribute that to Aquinas. They attributed that to Agnes because it was her relics that was the instrument of grace in that time. And here we are in the presence of his relics. Miracles have been associated with these relics. These relics have gone through, there's a history to these relics. Because when Aquinas dies in the Cistercian Abbey of Fosnova, the monks don't want to give up his body. So it takes basically 100 years for the Dominicans to duke it out in court. And we finally get 50 relics back, including the skull. There it is. In 1369, the Pope basically tells the monks, you've got to give him back to his brothers. And miracles have been associated with these relics for centuries. Now, this is just the skull. Again, it's a little complicated how the relics got split up. So his sister, who was then lady, went to the monks and said, I want a part of my brother. Because I need to give them that part to his brothers. So the story goes is that they exhumed his body. They were going to give her his right hand, his right arm, because that was the one that he used to write or to dictate, be involved in. His body was incorrupt. In fact, when they opened up the coffin, the room was completely overwhelmed with the fragrance of roses. So they had to take an axe out and they chopped off his arm. And they gave his arm to the friars. And we have his, I'm not sure where his arm is right now, the friar anyway. It's so Catholic. And it's deeply Catholic because we know that the body is precious. We know that even though Aquinas' soul is now beholding the glory of God, that this skull will rise from the dead. That's why we venerate this skull, because this skull one day will return to its owner. This skull one day will be reunited with that immortal soul. And then you will see the skull talk again. And you will see the skull glorifying God again. In the resurrected body of Aquinas, the angelic doctor. To close, what does this professor saint have to tell us? I went to his Summa, the second part of the Summa. I'm a moral theologian, so that's my part. And there's a part there we discuss his vocation, the living out the life. And he talks about what today we would call the balanced life. And I think I will end with this. How does he ask us to live our lives? And he says it's a mix between the active life and the contemplative life. So the active life is very clear. It's acting in the world to make real the kingdom of God in our times. Americans, and I can appreciate this now after 2.5 years in the Philippines, we're really good at the active life. Today, some would call it the workaholic life. But Aquinas also talks about the contemplative life. This is what I would like to close here. We're not just talking about the contemplative life for nuns and for monks. Because we the friars, we are neither monks, we're certainly not nuns. But we are called to live a contemplative life in the world. And so what is a contemplative life? And the elements of contemplative life, according to Aquinas, I think this is good. First of all, it has to be prayer. But it is a prayer of desire. It is a prayer where your desire speaks to God. You're longing, you're yearning for God. And this takes time because this is a grace. So there's contemplative prayer, the prayer of daily sitting, waiting, what my novice master called but prayer. What is but prayer? What prayer is when you have nothing to say to Jesus, but you put your butt in the church and you say, Lord, I am praying with my butt. My butt is here. My body is here. I am completely exhausted. I have nothing else to tell you. I can't listen to you, but my butt is here. Father Clem Burns, my novice master, told me 25 years ago, he said, brother, for most of your life, you will be doing but prayer. He was absolutely correct. You simply place your butt in front of the Blessed Sacrament, and you sit and you wait for love. Another element of the contemplative life is eutrophilia, the great virtue of play. Play. The contemplative has to be playful. Now, Aquinas will define it this way: unproductive activity with joy. I tell my students it's wasting time and having fun. Now it's interesting because Aquinas says that it's essential for a balanced life, a contemplative life, that we learn to play. Now this does not mean we're going to go out and play foosball, but we have to learn to enjoy and delight in life and waste time having fun. That's number 2. The third thing in contemplative life is rest. Again, my novice master was very brilliant at this. He said, you have to go 5 days every year on canonical retreat. The first 2 you will sleep. And sleeping is part of the retreat. It's the St. Joseph part. Prayer, play, and rest. Those are the 3 elements of the contemplative life that any one of us could incorporate into living it out today. And so as you come forward to venerate the relics of this great university professor, this great friend of God, Dominican saint, ask him for that grace. Ask him to be a contemplative in the world. So you can pray with the deepest longings and desires. So you can play and enjoy creation. And that you can rest, not only now, but in the life to come. Amen.